Welcome to this episode, everyone, to Searching for the Question Live. My name is David Orban, and if you have been following our streams and videos, this is episode 99. I don't know what is the number base that 99 is a round number in. 100 is round in base 10. 99 is round probably only in 99 base. But the reason why I care for this to be felt or perceived or interpreted as kind of round, because I see it a little bit as a crowning of a long series that we have addressed with a lot of wonderful friends and experts and professionals in their own fields about the progress of technology, how it impacts society, especially about AI, advanced AI, AGI, and robotics, and especially humanoid robots. And as all of these things come together and stop being science fiction, and they become the daily experience of more and more people, maybe today with ChatGPT on our phones, and with industrial robots that are isolated in their cages because they don't have an understanding of the world around them. But soon, not only the Roomba mapping out carefully our apartments as it is cleaning them, but more advanced robots that perceive their environment. Well, we have to understand what role humans as individuals, but humans also as communities are going to play. And very importantly, if we fought battles, even bloody battles in the 20th century, 100 years ago, to conquer rights for workers, things that now we take for granted, like having a weekend, or having paid holidays, or having health care, and so on and so forth. Well, what can we do in order to preserve or even enhance those rights that we have fought for in the 21st century? So, in order to discuss this and many other exciting topics, I invited my friend James Hughes, and I welcome him. James, welcome to Searching for the Question Live.
Delighted to be here, David.
So I always like to start asking my guests a little bit about their background and how did they get where they are today? What was the convoluted path, and what are the highlights that you would like to offer so that our audience can understand you a little bit better?
Well, I was born in 1961 in Columbus, Ohio, and so I came of age in the 70s in the aftermath of the hippies and the student left. And a lot of my my intellectual life has been a dialogue between my interest in spirituality, Buddhism in particular, and progressive politics of various kinds. But then the third element, the third person in that dialogue has been futurism. And when I first learned to read in third grade, I started reading science fiction, and I haven't stopped ever since. Big science fiction fan. And then when I started to understand that there was a field called futurism, I was very seriously engaged with that. So in college, I went to Sri Lanka to do development work in Sri Lanka, ordained as a Buddhist monk for a while there. Studied Buddhism again in Japan, and decided to do sociology as my doctoral work. Started to focus on the bioethics questions in sociology, partly inspired by the Buddhist questions around the personhood and the self. And in the 90s, I met the transhumanists and eventually became the executive director of the World Transhumanist Association. Wrote a book called Citizen Cyborg, which was a reflection on how being a person may change in the future and what we should do with that politically. And then the IET came out of the WTA, the World Transhumanist Association experience. The About half of us in the World Transhumanist Association executive formed the IET, and we initially were focused on the ideas that we call we became focused on the ideas what we call now techno-progressivism, which is basically everything from European liberalism to hardcore replace the market with the state kind of ideas, but a broad left-wing spectrum of ideas, trying to bring a techno-optimistic point of view to those perspectives. So our view is that many on the left are overly critical of technology or don't appreciate the importance of technology and the opportunities it presents. Many people in futurism have libertarian ideas that we would like to engage with. So that's been the focus of the IET, is this techno-progressive set of ideas. And we've brought that to existential risks. We used to work more closely with the now disestablished Future of Humanity Institute that was founded by Nick Bostrom, because Nick was one of the founders of the IET as well. So we worked on the existential risks issue, human enhancement, longevity dividend. We've worked with science fiction creators about having more realistic ideas about the future. And now we just ran a postdoc on the future of work here, which is what you wanted to talk to me about today. So for the last 2 years, we've been doing white papers and a lot of talks and thinking about the future of work.
Today's episode is necessarily political, since we are talking about society and how consensus can be built in a hopefully non-conflictual manner, but also how tensions build and can be resolved in a confrontation that can be tense, but should be hopefully still nonviolent. Do you feel that today the traditional axis of left and right is a valuable way of analyzing attitudes towards progress and towards technology, or towards the arc of human development? Or there is some sense in understanding people aggregating and being attracted to different topics and policies in a manner that the traditional way of left and right is not only representing, but actually is misinterpreting people's attitudes?
That's an excellent question, because I'm a sociologist, and my interest for 35 years has been whether and how technology issues are articulating with our current political landscape, and how it could articulate with the political landscape. When I got involved in the more transhumanist kind of ideas, I began to realize that there was a long tradition in the left before World War II of being very techno-optimistic. Lenin said that communism was socialism plus electrification. So the idea that industrial development and technological development would liberate humanity was more an idea on the left than it was on the right. But after World War II, that switched around because of environmentalism and neoliberalism and a variety of factors. But so we've been arguing for this kind of tradition within politically progressive Enlightenment thought, And within Enlightenment thought, you can see contemporary politics as having two basic dimensions: the pre-Enlightenment versus post-Enlightenment about liberal individualism, women's rights, secularism, nationalism, racism, things like that. There's a kind of progressive pole of that, and that you tend to have other progressive opinions along that spectrum, and a conservative end of it. The other major axis is the economic dimension, and those are pretty much on the terms of different views of the Enlightenment. That within the Enlightenment, there was the Scottish Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment. You can think about it. The French Enlightenment was more focused on the democratic state, or the possibility of a state being the vehicle for people's interests and equal rights. And the Scottish Enlightenment was more focused on market rights and individual rights to property and so forth. So within that kind of framework, we've had a debate for 200 years about how much market, how much state, what kinds of market and state. And the question I have been asking for 30 years, and that was a part of Citizen Cyborg, is whether these technology issues are a third dimension, or could be a third dimension, or whether they have are now a part of these two dimensions. And I think most of the evidence right now is pointing to the idea that college-educated people who tend to be more culturally and socially liberal tend to be more optimistic about technology, and blue-collar people, poor people, tend to be less optimistic. I think that can be turned around with the right kinds of policies. I think we should have a more proactive technological innovation regime. And so that's one of the things that we argue for, is that what's the impact of these divisions between people who are going to benefit from technology and those who don't think that they're going to benefit, and how can we turn that around?
I am not going to be able to quote the piece, but there's a wonderful scene in Brian of Nazareth when the group of Jews is sitting, I think, in a Colosseum, and they complain about the various movements and how
terrible the Roman Empire was.
A given person is not representing the true views of the movement, and they end up splintering in units of one, basically. And a little bit, facetiously, I am quoting that scene because sometimes the transhumanist movement seems to me, or it resembles a little bit that kind of ability of creating divisions rather than creating a unity around the view of the future that we are all going to inhabit anyway. And of course, I was chairman of Humanity Plus, which is the new name of what used to be the World Transhumanist Association. So I have had a first-hand experience of how intensely we could debate around things that, again, should have united us rather than divided us. Why do you think that is? And is that something that hobbles our common ability to make an impact that should be wide and deep?
Well, I don't know that transhumanism will ever be as influential a movement as something like feminism or environmentalism, but I hope it does grow and evolve in that way. But if you look at those other movements and histories, they fracture immediately as well. I mean, there's 50 different flavors of feminism, 50 different flavors of environmentalism. And when transhumanists began to think about electoral politics more seriously in the 2010s, I was counseling that transhumanism as an idea is really too thin to have a political party around. It's almost too thin to even have a think tank around, because our experience and your experience in Humanity Plus and the World Transhumanist Association is you can be for people having the right to use human enhancement technologies and be a monarchist or be a Putinist or be a Xi Jinpingist or whatever you want, So it's not incompatible with a wide variety of views, and that just makes it impossible for when you say, well, okay, what should the policy that the Food and Drug Administration should adopt towards human enhancement therapies. It's like, well, this group doesn't think there should be a Food and Drug Administration, and this group thinks, should control everything or something. So it was hard. So we had to. That's one of the reasons why we started the IAT. We just basically all agreed that there should be democratic states, and democratic states should do things for people, and that took a lot of arguments off the table. But I don't think transhumanism could be or will be the basis of a major political movement in the future. It is a culture, a subculture of ideas, but as its influence, and I think we can see its influence peripherally through the impact of the effective altruists and the AI safety people on Congress. I mean, they have mobilized $500 million in lobbying money to nonprofit institutions, the Future of Life Institute, for instance, Open Philanthropy, and embedded 100 well-trained scholars in Congress to influence AI regulation policy. I think it's a tremendous success story. It's also quite controversial given the people who gave the money and the way that the things that they're lobbying for. But to have well-educated people about artificial intelligence talking to completely ignorant Congress people about our AI risks to come, I think is overall a good thing. I'm more in favor of the European style regulations of AI than theirs. But so at any rate, when you compare transhumanism to those movements, we haven't had anything comparable. I think we could around particularly dramatic particularly dramatic human enhancement technologies that are going to come in the future. Brain-computer interfaces, radical life extension, human genetic modification, all of these are going to be regulatory issues of the next 10, 20 years.
So when you talk about European style regulation, to me, what it implies, and please correct me or complement my narrow view, is that it all starts from the precautionary principle. A new technology that by definition is not yet fully understood in terms of its implications and impacts is viewed with not a neutral approach, but with skepticism or at least caution, so that the onus on about the lack of harm is on the producer of a particular product or service. They must prove that either there is no harm or that the harm is minimal and vastly outweighed by the benefits. And until such time that they can do that, the technology cannot be introduced on the market.
I would say that if you look at the history of the the GDPR, DSA, DMA, the Digital Marketing Act, and the recent AI Act in the European Parliament, you can definitely see the precautionary principle people involved in those discussions, and they should be. That's one of the voices out there. But you can also see the influence of both foreign big tech and the folks who would aspire to be tech innovators in Europe. They made a pretty substantial argument that some of the regulations that were being proposed in the AI Act would further discourage European competitiveness in technological innovation. I think they're right. We do have to put that on the table. I'm very concerned about the geopolitical struggle over AI, for instance, and I think it's only to the benefit of liberal democracy and the values that we hold dear that Europe and the United States and Australia and the other democracies maintain a lead in these technological innovations. Until there's more democracy in the places that we're competing against. So I do think we want to be very careful about preserving technological innovation. But the AI Act, it creates a hierarchy of risk, and I think that approach makes sense. It says there are some systems which don't need prior approval or authorization. and others which do because of their potential impacts on society. And even though the American approach has been much more laissez-faire, the Biden AI regulatory proposals have also proposed that when you reach a certain point of compute, I'm not sure that compute is going to be the right way to go with this kind of risk assessment, but when you reach a certain level of compute, that you should enact different kinds of controls. So I think that's basically the right approach. And when we talk about workers' rights, for instance, the AI Act put things on the table like that firms should tell workers when they're using artificial intelligence that they should be auditing the impacts of artificial intelligence when they use them for things like hiring. Like, if you use a hiring algorithm and you just ask, given the history of the white guys who've worked here for the last 50 years, what do you think that an African American Muslim woman's going to fit in our workplace? The AI algorithm generally says, probably not, you should hire more white guys. So I think those are the kinds of problems that we need to be monitoring, that firms should be obliged to monitor, tell workers what they're doing about them. I don't see that as harmful to the economy or innovation. But there is this question about why Europe has not developed a competitive AI sector, and some would attribute it to Brussels. And I think that that's more or less a red herring. I think there are a lot of cultural and economic factors in Europe that have explained that better.
Yes, and as we are streaming this, the European elections just happened a few days ago with pretty important gains of right side or right-wing parties, and they may, for example, say that AI should be sovereign, right? That there should be European or maybe even national AIs, and that will be very interesting, in my opinion, because the implications are important, regardless of the reasons or the reasonableness of the starting point. It will mean that not only there will be incentives for at least European, but maybe national champions to be helped along, but in my opinion, it will need a vertical integration that today is completely absent, not only in the software, but also data centers, chips, energy, and since I am in favor of a large variety of approaches in order to find out actually what works, which in my opinion can only be done from the bottom up rather than the top down, and experiments need to be well designed and carefully planned and executed, but it is only through experiments that we can understand what actually works. So since I am in favor of that, this kind of fragmentation of the various efforts rather than a single monolithic approach, the West goes one way, China goes the other way, and let's fight it out, is in my opinion something that could be good.
Yeah, well, actually, we just did a deep dive on the moral and political reasoning of LLMs. And there's great research now that tests them on various scales. And they generally reflect the values of Silicon Valley, the ones that, from Silicon Valley reflect the values of Silicon Valley. So young, educated, secular people who generally are utilitarian and thinking and things so forth. So at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party has just released a chat bot to guide the study of Xi Jinping thought. In their, of course, imposing very, very strong strictures on what LLMs can do and the kind of prior authorization of what they can say in China. So I'm sure that you're absolutely right that there will be Islamist LLMs, there will be CCP LLMs, far right LLMs. I think we thought that Grok from Elon was going to be more of a far right LLM. Turned out it was still too liberal for his fans, but maybe just because it's smart. It's hard to make something really smart that dumb. So, but yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that for me, I'm not a moral realist, so I don't believe that the smarter you get, the closer you approximate moral truth. I think you can make very sophisticated arguments for terrible positions. So I suspect that we will see a huge proliferation of different kinds of LLMs. Yeah.
Okay, let's put a pin on that and remember to go back to what you just said maybe in a bit, because that has implications on your potential evaluation of existential risks.
Yeah.
Linked to AI, but hopefully we will remember to go back. Okay, so the and what you just said is not only applicable to AI, but probably represents your position with respect to society overall. Moral evolution is not a necessity. We have to want it to happen, and we need certain kinds of support structures. We have to have an infrastructure that allows our dreams to become reality if we want a certain kind of life and opportunities for a wide number of people or for everyone to be possible. And that is why the battles of 100 years ago matter, because those battles were, or the outcome of those battles is not a given. Fascism lost
We
to
thought.
a very large degree, exactly, or at the time. Well, as a matter of fact, in the 20s, maybe a lot of people thought that a lot of battles would lead to a world where fascism and what then became Nazism couldn't emerge, but it did. It did then. And so I would say we were naive, whatever decade we felt that we didn't have to worry, because the foundations of democracy and liberal ways of life were sound and solid, and we were fine. We were naive and we were wrong. So the battles matter, the outcomes of the battles matter, and they are not a given. Apart from trying not to be naive, what other lessons can we learn from those battles of 100 years ago that are applicable today?
Well, this is another question, of course, that's been much on my mind since the rise of fascism really sent me into a funk. You know, the election of Donald Trump in the United States, I'm still suffering from post-Trump derangement syndrome. But it led to the broader question of, if we see a global rise in far-right strongman authoritarian politics within democracies, people like Viktor Orban and Trump, Modi, in authoritarian regimes becoming more authoritarian, more fascistic, like Russia. I believe China also fits that category. So that phenomenon around the world, what things might it hold in common? And I'm not the kind of left analyst who would say capitalism, 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 because capitalism can do all, capitalism can work in any kind of environment, a totalitarian one or a liberal democratic one. But there are ways to understand the growing alienation that's leading to a populist backlash in many countries. And part of that alienation reflects this anxiety, I think, on the part of many working class and poor people about whether the future that technology is pushing us towards and the people who are going to benefit, whether they're going to benefit from that at all. And I do think that that kind of populism is one of the explanations for this globalized populist reaction. It's mixed up with, however, a lot of cultural stuff as well, because one of the things that's happening globally is the decline of traditional sex and gender arrangements, family structures, sexual opportunities and identities. And these are some of the most fundamental parts of being a human. I mean, we became sexually dichotomous 2 billion years ago as as biological species, and ever since then, it's a very deep part of our culture, our psychology. I believe we're entering into a post-gender period where being a particular gender is something that is not only not going to determine your life chances, but you'll also be able to change many aspects of it if you want to. And that's why the transgender issue has been so central for a lot of the far right backlash around the world, because it's such a fundamental threat to the idea of absolute gender essentialism and the roles that are supposed to go with it. So I think that's a part of, it's an under-discussed part of this global phenomenon. It's a reason why strongman politics, with the exception of, Georgie Maloney, the sexy MILF fascist, and, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some exceptions, but in general, it's strongman politics. And by the way, congratulations to the people of India for finally putting a roadblock in the way of the Modi bulldozer with their elections, largest election in the world. So, yeah, I think there are a lot of factors going on. The globalization of information through the internet, and I think is one of the both terrorizing and optimistic aspects of this whole century, is that I have always believed that our solutions to many of our problems rely on international cooperation, transnational organizations. And so the development of transnational identity has been something I'm very closely monitored for a long time. And I think you see, and that's one of the reasons I'm very excited about the European project, because it is a transnational project, a project predicated on the defense and extension of liberal democracy. So I want more such projects, and I hope that transnational communication would support them. But it also seems to be supporting people, there were far-right alliances before the internet, but it seems to be supporting a new kind of far-right internationalization that is very troubling and worrying.
There are reasons to believe that the easy and blunt tools of violent conflict, civil wars, wars among nations, that were the basis of a certain kind of progress, because they would make tabula rasa, and new institutions, new players would come forth, shouldn't be applied today. The simplest reason is, with nuclear weapons elevating conflict, going into tactical or strategic use of nuclear weapons, the risks of global annihilation are just too large. But of course, even with the local conflicts, we can have enormous amounts of suffering, maddeningly negating our expectation that we can analyze and resolve complex challenges and complex problems better than in the past. Europe has been very interesting, an experiment, and I don't mind calling it still an experiment. In a Popperian sense. You can never verify that it is working. You can only falsify that it is. You can only state that it stopped working, right? And I think it is also healthy to say, okay, we have to try harder to make sure that the experiment keeps working. And Europe as a project took advantage of crises in various moments in order to make itself stronger. Even the name European Union was approved as a change from the EEC, the European Economic Community, and or whatever else preceded it. And there are now people who would want to bring the union even closer, especially from a fiscal point of view that still divides it in economic zones that keep it to a large degree isolated and form United States of Europe. Um, and it could very well be one of the reasons why in many areas of startups and technological initiatives, Europe hasn't been able to um, build leading players like the US, um, because it is a fragmented market, not because of regulations and whether investment or the stock markets themselves are still fairly provincial, fairly small compared to what is needed. So what now I brought up the issue of civil wars and wars to highlight a possible difference from the past. Not that we wouldn't be able to fight a war, we are fighting many wars, but we shouldn't. Uh, what other differences would you highlight that the battles of the 21st century to maintain and improve or promote the rights of individuals and communities should have compared to the past?
Let me just say about war. I think nuclear weapons was actually the beginning of when it became clear to many thinkers, at any rate, that the world probably needs stronger transnational institutions to control the risks of weapons of mass destruction. And we've had the International Atomic Energy Agency and other anti-nuclear proliferation treaties, anti-bioweapons treaties, and so forth. And they all founder on the global geopolitical divisions, that we can't trust you and you aren't letting us see X, Y, and Z. And then we trump up reasons to invade Iraq, and we shake our fist at Iran and North Korea, and nothing seems to happen. So more progress in strengthening those institutions and those conflict resolution mechanisms are necessary, and they may take some significant changes in geopolitics. Of course, I'm a staunch defender of Ukraine, and I've been hoping that a defeat for Russia in Ukraine would cause regime change in Russia. China is, its own nut to crack in terms of democratization, but I think there are prospects for democratization in Russia that could happen, and that they could eventually join the European Union in a global, a set of agreements about these kinds of things. China actually has some fairly far-sighted people working on AI policy. Whether whether they're good, a trustworthy actor in these negotiations, of course, is always a problem, since at least half of the AI development in China is under the thumb of the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and that's never going to be a part of the negotiations for intellectual property rights or AI safety or whatever. At any rate, so yeah, progress on the geopolitical front, I think people should pay a lot more attention to. And the kinds of things that I have always promoted is the strengthening of, for instance, the UN Declaration of Human Rights as a legal document, the International Court of Justice, ways of attempting to establish a global rule of law. And we could start with the really easy cases of sending blue helmets to suppress pogroms and genocides, which we were unable to get done in a couple of different cases, like the Sudan. But blue helmets are, I think there's like 25 blue helmet installations around the world right now. So the strengthening of transnational military force, I think, is a good thing in general. I'm actually a kind of ironic supporter of Macron's idea of a European army, because I think the United States is a declining hegemon. We're not a good example anymore of the kind of values that we used to promote, if we ever were. We had racial segregation and all kinds of things to hamper our reputation in the past.
Propping up dictatorship, right. And making regime change a tool of global economic extension.
All of that, bring it on, just put it on the table. And we also can't afford it. We've got 170 military bases around the world. We can't afford that. We spend more on defense than all European countries combined, I think, something like that. Poland's actually pulling out ahead. Poland's going to spend 3 or 4% of its GDP on military defense. But at any rate, I think we need to definitely be thinking about weapons of mass destruction and having that at the top of our agenda. That's where I and people from effective altruism and long-termism and AI safety, we all agree that bioweapons, weapons of mass destruction should be a very high political priority. Now, whether you go down the road of saying, okay, that's such a high priority that we don't want to mess around with political things that might cause conflict between nuclear armed or bioweapon states or whatever, like giving Ukraine to Russia, for instance, in order to ameliorate their nuclear threats. I mean, that's where we have to get into the hard politics of and the futurism that people see. I just published a piece, by the way, about pronatalism, the debate over whether we need more babies, which I do argue that we do. And one of the things that I argue in that piece is that I think we futurists should take how uncertain the future is more seriously in the way that we think about things. The focus on existential risks and weapons of mass destruction in particular is in the existential risk community considered, a strange attractor. If you compare futures where there's somebody and people continue to reproduce versus futures where there's nobody, then obviously you want to prevent those futures with nobody. Except you're not obliged to try to do anything about those futures if you don't have any idea what you can do. And I think we're in that situation. I mean, as a sociologist, I've always been interested in the kind of an Asimov's foundation psychohistorical kind of proposal, right? That if we knew enough about the way society worked and minds worked, and we had the right kind of AI, we could predict where things are going and make decisions accordingly. Or maybe the acid version of that is, Paul Atreides in Dune, trying to discern the different paths in the multiverse. I just don't think we know enough, because artificial intelligence, I took seriously when people argued that artificial intelligence was going to be a singularity. It was going to be as opaque a barrier in our predicting the future as as a black hole. And so as a consequence, I think we should be focusing on this century and the things that we know are probably going to happen this century. Existential risks will be bad this century. We don't have to think about, the 22nd century or a billion years in the future to know that existential risks are bad.
So there is a two-pronged attack being unleashed by technology in the status quo of workers, white-collar workers being disrupted from the top in their creative endeavors by software platforms that, according to the lens of the investment that they needed in order to develop their craft, are demeaning what they set out to achieve in their professional lives, whether they are artists, journalists, even more mundane professions like lawyers or accountants, are running the risk of being commoditized by ChatGPT and its ilk. And on the other hand, coming a bit later, but in my view, unstoppably still, is the disruption that blue-collar workers of all professions and trades are going to also feel as a consequence of humanoid robots stepping out of science fiction and into our world. And a lot of the anguish that we described that gave rise to the false promise of right-wing politics is due to the inability of a lot of people to extend the limits of their adaptability and to feel that they have a place in the future, that they have a hard time understanding, interpreting, and finding a way to design a life of dignity and purpose in. A classic example, in my view, is the scandalous statement that the 50-year-old truck driver losing his job because the truck is now driving itself shouldn't worry, because they can always learn to be a web developer, right? I would have no hesitation punching someone in the face if I were that truck driver and they told me that is what I should do after I've been driving the truck for 30 years and pretending that I can just reinvent myself is completely crazy. So let's start with not what the solutions are, but what are the ways that usefully, not panic-inducing, control the people who are bringing problems are trying to control you, right? Because you're paralyzed by your inability to understand the problems, let alone finding a solution. So the people who are highlighting the problems alone are likely against your interests. But what, in your opinion, are the right ways to make everyone aware of this potential onslaught while making sure that they don't feel paralyzed?
Well, first, let me say that I have believed for a long time, 30 years or so, that artificial intelligence in particular, but automation in general, will eventually reduce the amount of work in society. That we can see that it's already reduced the number of hours that working people have to spend in work, and certainly changed the nature of work. Um, so I believe that the good society, the society we should be aspiring to, is one which continues those trends, which allows us to work less and less. And for me, a universal basic income, or in general, the expansion of the welfare state and the social welfare system, but in particular, UBI, is the kind of policy that would address the long-term consequences of technological unemployment and precariousness. In the last decade, there was a lot of attention to the impacts of automation on the labor market. There has been for 50 years. And in the last decade, the kind of general consensus was that there were jobs at the top that required a lot of education and creativity that were more immune, and there were jobs at the bottom of the pay scale that required a lot of physical skills that were probably immune because we wouldn't have robots that can do them yet. And the jobs that were disappearing due to automation and that were impacting trade union membership and things like that were the routine jobs in between, the routine physical jobs and routine mental jobs. Now, with the advent of LLMs, I think people have woken up to the fact that at the high end, a lot of what we thought was creative labor may be automatable in very short order, or at least that the kinds of workers who do that work, who can figure out how to use artificial intelligence to do that work, and are going to be able to do a lot more of that kind of work, and that will also have an impact on the labor market. I mean, how much graphic design does society really need if one person can now do the graphic design of for 10 others or 100 others, whatever. So at the high end, we're going to have we're going to have already see anxiety among white collar workers and creative workers and managers and people like that about their precariousness. At the bottom, I think we're going to see humanoid robots really begin to come into the market in the next couple of years. Billions potentially of humanoid robots produced. China's got firms. We've got firms. There's firms in Europe. And I think humanoid robots, from a sociological point of view, right now about 5% of Americans are using LLMs on a regular basis. I'm one of them. I don't know why you wouldn't. But for most people, they don't really see the use case. So I think the use case for LLMs and artificial intelligence probably is going to come from these AI agent kind of architectures, where you have a personal assistant that you can talk to, and it tells you what you need to do every day, and scopes out the best restaurant to go to, and all that kind of stuff. And kind of automating all the things that we've picked up as an agglomeration of skills. I think that's going to have an impact on our lives in the next couple of years. But in terms of the putting LLMs into humanoid robots, and the humanoid robots being very facile and able to walk around in a natural way and pick things up and make dinner for you and all that kind of stuff. I'm writing a paper right now about the use of humanoid robots in homes for senior home care. And of course, this is one of the kinds of occupations, very low paid, difficult to find those workers in a lot of environments, and a huge growing need of seniors who need that kind of support. And a humanoid robot's the perfect solution to that if we can get it down to the price point. And then we've got all the questions of making them safe and protecting people's privacy and so forth. But so I think humanoid robots are going to have an impact in our day-to-day lives that may, I think the automation's already underway, and I think the economic impacts are already underway. But once you are actually sitting there with a humanoid robot, it may be a very different situation. But at any rate, so there's the impact of artificial intelligence and automation on how we work, and then there's the impact on whether we get to work or not in the future. We don't see much technological unemployment yet. Most of the declines in the proportion of the population that are in paid employment are coming because of the demographic changes as the baby boomers retire, and there are fewer younger people. And so we're beginning to see that old age ratio go in the direction that everyone has expected, from like 6 young workers for every senior retiree to 1 eventually. And in that context, I think that young labor is going to be much more expensive. I think it's going to be harder to attract workers in that environment. And already we see the investment calculus shifting from investing in human labor versus capital, that is machines and technology, that the machines and technology are the better bet for long-term profitability. So in that context, I think we will eventually see technological unemployment. Now, there's the kind of diffuse, like I work in a university, and I wrote a paper a couple of years ago about how do we really need teachers or professors? And very few of my colleagues want to talk about that. I said, well, AI can do this, it can do this, it can do this, it can do this. And all the research for 50 years has shown that an AI tutor is as good as being in a classroom for math or basic writing or whatever it is. And the AI tutors that we're going to have in a couple of years, like Khan Academy has just introduced Khanmigo, which is their AI tutor that follows your kid from kindergarten through grade 12. I think that's pretty much the ideal scenario, right? Personalized tutoring that's specific for your kid, and where you're not trying to force them through the industrialized public education system. So I think that's the way things are headed. But how quickly will universities or public schools or private schools adopt a system that displaces actual human teachers with artificial intelligence? Probably not very soon. And the same thing's true in healthcare. I mean, I think doctors could, I think a lot of doctors probably shouldn't be doing diagnosis and treatment decision making anymore, or they should just be kind of advisors to the AI system, because the AI systems are demonstrating that they're doing it better. But how long is it going to take before patients or hospitals or healthcare regulators will approve of a system that relies more heavily on AI than on the doctor? So
So,
it's gonna take a while to work its way through.
oh yeah, and there is a very natural uh, rhythm to things renewing themselves that is linked to the generations rising and then dying. And one of the consequences that I always use of radical life extension is provocatively saying, your enemies never die, right? Or in the case of these institutions, the old professor controlling scientific publications or teaching opportunities or tenure never retires. And in some sense, the two examples that you gave, healthcare and education, I think are very interesting because, contrary to what you said, I would posit that it is already happening. Basically, for the past 30 years or more, if we look rather than the individual, we look at the institution, it has been um, adapting itself to a world of abundance where the proportion of teachers and doctors is diminishing. But since labor or the economy, more in the abstract, is not a closed system, there is not a finite amount of economy that we can do, and the educational institutions and the health institutions um, are designed to promote their own existence. They have been complementing this diminishing portion of the essential workers with uh, a bloated and almost cancerous amount of bureaucracy and regulations and what a lot of people call, I think, very appropriately, bullshit jobs. Jobs that are unnecessary, but they are created because our way of evaluating the worth of a human life is to see whether they are working, and if they are not, we say they are worthless. Um, and this is an important mechanism that is going to exist in many areas. One solution, in my opinion, potentially important, sometimes tested, is to make sure that every regulation has a sunset clause so that you know every 5 years or 10 years, whenever it is, they expire, and then you have to reassess whether they can be reapproved or they need to be updated or completely eliminated because, I don't know, the regulations on collection of horse manure in New York City were very important 100 years ago, but not much today, or less so. Um, and and to some degree, I think this is the crux of the matter. If we can uh, hack people's minds such that after being told for 200 years to be very disciplined worker bees in one or another of the areas, they can really blossom and they can really feel free to experiment and to find out what they like, where their talents are, and explore decade after decade new things that they want to do. Then they may realize that um, the world of abundance that AI and robots are capable of creating can support them. rather than oppress them, rather than put them aside or even eliminate them from the economic and social picture. And so this, um, you know, I am searching for the right kind of words. The weakest word is educating people to realize this, and it is weak because it supposes an authority that knows what people should be learning. Uh, the most provocative way is what I use, the hacking of the minds, or uh, influencing people. Uh, and so there should be a middle ground between these extremes. Uh, how do you feel about the possibility to not only let people realize this in theory, but finding paths so that they can put it into practice? And UBI, you already mentioned, is going to be a foundational tool. I prefer calling it unconditional rather than universal. And the reason is I fear it will be an instrument of state um, blackmail, where you have to earn your right to the universal basic income, rather than being actually a universal right, just like other human rights, and there are no conditions attached to it, right? A recent analogy that I started using to describe the world of abundance is to say, when you are born, no one starts counting the breaths you take in order to present you with the bill when you are 18. Okay, now this is the amount of oxygen you have to pay back because we loaned it to you. Air is abundant, and it is not even true that we are consuming oxygen. We are just circulating it, right, in the various forms. So, um,
Just
what is the path?
on
What
that
is the
point
path?
about conditionality, I
Okay.
first got turned on to the concept of UBI from the works of the French theorist Andre Gortz, who was writing about it back in the 80s. And he was also one who believed that eventually we would automate all labor and that we needed to organize a movement of non-workers for a non-working future, right? And which is a hard thing to do. It's we know how to organize workers for workers' rights. We don't know how to organize non-workers for non-workers' rights. Um, and one of the things that he thought about universal basic income back then was that it shouldn't be unconditional, on the grounds that this is the establishment of a social contract between the citizen and the state, and that there are certain things that we might want to say as a citizen you need to do. And one of those things might be like voting or getting your kids to school or whatever it is. Like Brazil, when they introduced child subsidies, you had to get your kid to school in order to get the child subsidy. I'm open to that kind of debate, but of course, most of the people who have been advocating for UBI are unconditional UBI people for the reasons that you mentioned. And if you see that the way that Modi has built his power by distributing grain to poor people in India, you do, with his face on it, of course, you do begin to worry about, Trump bucks being the basis of the, Trump 1,000-year Reich or something like that. So yeah, I don't want it to be conditional, and I don't want it to be too tightly tied to particular parties or but I think it's inevitable that it's going to be based on the state. It has to. I mean, the idea is like Sam Altman, when he was trying to get people to do his eyeball scanning, universal UBI thing. I don't think any non-state based UBI is a serious proposal. It's just basically a fantasy.
So Emiliano is asking whether robots and AIs should be taxed, and the answer is, to a large degree, they already are. In theory, corporations should be paying taxes on their profits. Now, turns out that as a portion of their revenue, the amount of taxes that corporations pay is negligible, especially the large tech companies, because of how adroit they are in exploiting loopholes in the tax system. So a potential proxy would be a very, very broad participation, the shareholder participation, and I haven't checked the sources, but the data that I have, I don't know if you have other numbers, is that um, for those U.S. families that have savings, and that is already just a fraction of the total, half of the savings are in the stock market, which is a huge percentage, pretty risky too, as opposed to Europe, where a much larger proportion is real estate or government bonds rather than the stock market. But if taxation doesn't work because of the loopholes, and shareholder participation is only possible if you have savings and you buy those stocks, adding the fact that some of these technologies have extremely evident strategic implications, do you expect, just to be very specific and explicit, the United States to nationalize OpenAI in the next 5 years?
Well, some of the folks who just defected from OpenAI to Anthropic were actually talking about that last week in terms of their own futurism about how significant LLMs and foundation models are going to be. Let's see. In terms of the things that you were talking about there, you distracted me with your last point. Sum it all up. What were you talking about?
So I said that the corporations should be paying taxes rather than escaping them. That shareholder participation is a good thing because not only from a financial point of view, but also gets people involved in the economy in many different ways, right? But it is only available to a percentage of the families. And then if both of these things fail, nationalizing corporations justified by their strategic importance becomes something that could be unavoidable.
Well, let's start with, in general, I'm supportive of progressive taxation as a way to fund the state. But the problem with taxing income in a future where income and work is going to be impacted by artificial intelligence is that it may become an unsustainable model to for a shrinking number of workers to support the state. It's especially unsustainable if we have any kind of radical life extension, but it's already unsustainable in a lot of places without radical life extension just because of the number of seniors who are weighing on the state. So we've got to think seriously, and most of the policy debate about this has been about rolling back pensions or raising the retirement age, things like that. It's not the direction I think most of us want to go, certainly when you see the riots in places like Paris. So I think instead, more universalistic social reform proposals like UBI are a way to get out of this impasse about taxation and redistribution. Now, where's the money going to come from for UBI then, or for any of the social welfare state? And here, I'm certainly on board with the idea of using targeted taxation as an instrument of industrial policy. I think it's one of the obligations of states. One of the few things that I think I probably applaud of Xi Jinping's technology policy was he decided Chinese kids were playing way too many computer games, and not enough Chinese kids were going into engineering real stuff, and too many of them were being attracted to the entertainment sector. So he put the kibosh on a lot of those entertainment oriented firms, locked up some of their CEOs, and put a law in place that Chinese kids can only play 1 hour of computer games on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday night, and they can't play it any other time. So, we never want those kind of policies in the West, but if the government could, as a matter of policy, direct industrial development in one direction versus another, I think we'd all agree less social media apps, more everything else. So in terms of targeted industrial policy and taxation, I'm a big supporter of carbon taxation, for instance. I think the global climate crisis is sufficiently pressing that we should be staunchly taxing carbon and putting that money into general use. I'm a supporter of the Tobin tax, which is an international tax on financial transactions that some have proposed could be the basis for a fiscal basis for international operations like the United Nations, refugee services, development work, and so forth. Now, when it gets to a country saying, oh, you are inventing something that's putting people out of work, should we discourage that by taxing it, which is effectively what it would do? And then use that taxation to ameliorate the costs that you're causing to society. I think then that raises the question of, is this the direction we want to go in? Do we want to go even faster in this direction, maybe with good safeguards, but have even more automation or less automation? I don't think that there's any argument. For me, it seems obvious we want more automation. We want it to be safe. We want it to be well regulated, but we want more automation, more artificial intelligence. And that's going to it can potentially lead to more freedom for everybody. I don't see any necessary reason why we need to discourage it. Now, we do need to put money into the amelioration part of it, because as we've already discussed, I think there's a substantial amount of anxiety on the part of everybody now about what the impacts of these things are going to be. Job retraining, as you mentioned, with factory workers, job retraining is something that's much discussed and not very much evidence of it being terribly effective. If you sent some truck driver to get a computer coding degree in 1999, and then the market collapses for computer coding the next year because of LLMs or whatever, you see the problem. It's very difficult. And I'm an advocate in terms of higher education's adaptation to this rapidly changing marketplace. I think we should get away from the 4-year degree and have more micro degrees, have skill badging for SQL and LLM prompting, or whatever the new occupations are, but not have it be a 4-year degree, have it be a 6-month certificate or something like that. But we still don't see a lot of take up. I mean, some firms like big tech firms and some Wall Street 500s, they've said, oh, we'll take a look at people who don't have a traditional college degree but have a sufficient number of badges from Google or something. We'll take a look at their skills. I think that's great. That's the direction we should go. Competency-based education, where you don't have to sit in a chair for a certain number of hours. You can just prove, if you're smart enough, you just take the test and you prove that you can do it. That kind of education, I think, is necessary, and we need to support it. And we need everybody to have access to it. I mean, as you know, in the United States, it can cost, $100,000 to $300,000, $400,000 now to go to a 4-year institution, and not mine, but some in the neighborhood here in Boston that you may have heard of, and that's just untenable. Those models are crazy. It's crazy.
Well, not only, but as I said before, and I don't know if you agree, the reason why it has become so expensive is not because it started to teach so much better, but because it must cover its own bureaucracy. And linked to that, don't you think there is also a danger that as the state proves to everyone that it must maintain itself, a very large proportion of the additional revenues are going to what I termed bullshit jobs and bureaucracy in the state itself? When we talk about automation of the economic production, well, shouldn't we also apply the same measure to the performance of the state and our governments and governance? Shouldn't it be automated to a large degree as well?
Absolutely. I wrote about this 4 years ago in an essay called Post-Human Governance, if people want to look it up. Um, and basically, I pointed to some suggestive trends that we may already see the automation of government services. We certainly see people in defense departments talking about the replacement of soldiers with various kinds of robotics and the declining need for infantry and those kinds of things. We see in social service administration the automation leading, the term becoming going postal in the United States, which came out in the 1990s, I think. It was because so many postal workers in the United States were being laid off by automation that some of them occasionally picked up a rifle and started shooting people. So we've already seen trends of automation in public employment in various ways. And if you look at McKinsey and other consulting firms, they have a raft of proposals for how a lot of government work could be automated. Now, I think that should come, and I think that's one big problem with a lot of people's imagination about how we're going to address technological unemployment. If they believe we're going to get there, some people would argue that we just should expand public employment. And I think there is an argument for that in the things which can't be automated yet, things like senior care. But eventually, as we've discussed, if you have a humanoid robot who costs, $30,000 or something, I can tell you that you can spend a lot more than that on one human home care worker, in a year, depending on the needs of your senior. So we're going to get into a situation where even for unmet social needs, planting trees and taking care of people and whatnot, the logic is not going to be that we have to hire a human, because it's going to be so much more obvious that we should do it with machines. So I think you're right. We're going to see a decline in the public sector, and that it's not going to compensate for declines in private sector employment in the way that some imagine.
Now, some people look at the economy as a closed system, and I remarked that it is an open system capable of creating new needs and new services and new jobs of various kinds, whether those jobs are filled by humans or robots. And then another question that may be worth clarifying is that the inputs and outputs of the economy, production and consumption, are also not only dependent on human factors, but can reproduce themselves in non-human forms. Robots consume electricity. The colonization of the solar system is going to be in proportion 99% a robotic endeavor, even if humans are going to be inhabiting the solar system by the billions. It only means that there will be trillions of robots for the billions of humans, right? So the role of humans in this world, whether producers or even consumers of goods and services, is likely to be smaller and smaller. How do you feel from a philosophical, ethical, and aesthetic even perspective this diminishing role will impact the human psyche?
Well, I still can't imagine what an economy in which robots or artificial intelligence plays a co-equal or plays a role as consumers within that economy. I do believe in the possibility, in the imminent possibility of machine sentience, machine selfhood. And I think we need to be watching out for that very carefully. And that means potentially we could have humanoid robots or other kinds of machine minds that are co-equals within our democratic polity. And that's some of what I was trying to address with the book Citizen Cyborg, how we're going to deal with that. But I think for the time being, my attention is on what's called the socialist calculation debate and the role of planning and in both creating new things and then distributing the things that get created. Um, I'm pretty convinced that market mechanisms are still the best for inventing new things. Various, we can support them by giving everyone a good education, good physical infrastructure, having a rational regulatory and legal regime, et cetera, et cetera. But that planning to create new stuff has been not very successful. However, if you look at books like People's Republic of Walmart about the development of coordination systems and distribution systems within large corporations, in this case Walmart, and you start to think about the role of preference algorithms in Netflix and Spotify and Amazon and all the different platforms have various preference algorithms which are trying to figure out empirically on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis, what kind of things are there in the world, what kind of people are you, and what kind of things do people like you like. And when you look at how that works, for instance, within Walmart, like Walmart has predictive algorithms that says, we know for a variety of reasons that we're going to need to send more toilet paper to Peoria, Illinois this month. And generally they're right. So the coordination mechanisms within our society, I think, can become increasingly automated to facilitate our consumption. It may not facilitate, will still be new stuff that comes out of the entrepreneurial sector, but I think we're going to have increasing automation of our consumption, as we've already seen. Now, when that might, change so that we become a less important part of the economy than we currently are. I mean, a lot of big tech relies on both our consumer decision making and the data that allows them to predict our consumer decision making. So I still think that's a pretty big part of the biggest corporations in the world are all trying to figure that out. They're not trying to figure out what robots want
yet. We mentioned at the beginning AI as a complex developing system that the protagonists building are themselves looking at uncomprehendingly because they don't have the tools to deeply analyze or conclusively analyze them. And several are jumping to the conclusion that this lack of deep understanding is concerning, and that neglecting the necessity of deepening this understanding could be extremely dangerous. Where do you fall on the spectrum of not being worried or being terrified by what advanced AI could bring? Let's say within the next 10 years, not in 100 years, but within the next 10 years.
Well, one phrase that gets thrown around is your P-doom, right? Your predicted doom from AI. I have never been a P-doom denier. I've always had some P-doom in my futurism, in the sense that I've always believed that runaway AI could be a possibility at some point. And as a consequence, I think that being more realistic about those scenarios has been one of my concerns about the people who tended to address them in the past. I think I believe in more of a scenario where artificial intelligence kind of replicates the stages of an ecosystem, and we're going to have AI rats and dogs and cats and all kinds of things running around on the internet, and they're going to be pets. Some of them are going to be real pests, and some of them are going to be pets, and so forth. So eventually we may have the breakout, AI gorilla, and that could, and I think we should all be preparing for that. But so I do have P-doom in my scenario, and I think it's raised significantly, as it has for many over the last 2 years, as I've seen what LLMs have been able to break out and do. However, I still think it's not, I'm not a Yudkowskiist at this point. I don't think we should be bombing AI centers. I've always been impressed that the people who really believe in a strong PDOM, like Ellie, that they have not hooked up with people who want to take more forceful measures about these things, because the template's right there in Terminator 2. She figures out, oh, if I just kill this guy, and that was basically behind the Unabomber. The Unabomber thought,
Yeah.
it was all headed that direction, and he just needed to kill the right people. So I do think there's a possibility for more conflict. I mean, right now the OpenAI attempted coup at OpenAI is rivets the attention, but there were no guns involved. But there could very well be. We're a very heavily armed society. You convince some QAnon people that artificial intelligence is a liberal plot to put chips in their brain, and you could see some people dead.
And
So
the rapid development of drone technology in the Ukraine-Russia conflict
yeah.
is pointing to the direction of what we call murder bots, and some of us signed an open letter for banning lethal autonomous weapons. Also, Emiliano is pointing out that we may end up with an infrastructure that is heavily dependent on AI, but not resilient enough to sustain the civilization that could break down if we let it control our vital infrastructure.
When I teach students about basic sociology, I start with the question of power. How do you get people to do stuff? You can either force them with coercion, you can persuade them with money, or you can persuade them with your words. And I think artificial intelligence is allowing the people who have power in society to rely on fewer and fewer, less and less convincing of soldiers that they should support the regime, and more capital investments for coercion. It's allowing capital investments to also influence the creation of persuasion. And of course, they often control the resources in society. So I think there's a serious, as with every technology, every technological innovation changes the terrain of power and allows for the possibility of more concentration of power, less. But in the particular, the case of the automation of the military, of drones, of policing and surveillance, I think if you look at someplace like China, we could be building the totalitarian model that George Orwell was worried about, the model that is so complete as a totalitarian model that it's impossible to overturn or critique or change. And so I do worry about that. I'm not worried about it in the sense of signing on to an international ban on the use of automated lethal robotics, because I don't think we have the geopolitical. I mean, as we've seen in Ukraine, Ukraine also has sent robot drones to attack Moscow. So, and those are Liberty drones, and the other ones are fascist drones. And I'm on the side of Liberty drones. So I don't think that an international convention that basically would only stop the people in the democratic world from using these tools, that's really the way to go yet. But I am worried about it for sure.
You mentioned the crucial word, persuasion. I am a big supporter of the development of the science of memetics. That there used to be a journal of memetics founded by Daniel Dennett and others a couple of decades ago. And at the time, it didn't succeed, potentially because we didn't yet have social networks and the amount of data that now we have available in order to study how actually memes work, whether they are funny pictures shared on the internet or fit or unfit ideas that spread and take hold of people's minds. You mentioned Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, and it is fascinating because, a bit of a spoiler, the original assumption is that you did need a population as large as a planet in order to be able to model what would happen. But then in the second novel, or maybe the third, I don't remember. There is a mutant that is able to actually
The
change
mule.
people's behavior, called the mule, by playing a particular instrument, and it must be opposed by the operators of the second foundation, leveraging his affection and emotions, turning his own power against him in order to put back the project where it was. So,
I strongly identify with the foundation in that series because I see myself as someone in the declining empire. You know, that's the way the foundation saw themselves, trying to plot a way for the declining empire to lead to a better world. And then all of a sudden, out of blue, comes all these freaking fascists and their strongman politics. And it's like, this isn't the future I was thinking about at all. But anyway, go ahead.
and so the advanced tools of AI are what Asimov represented in the second foundation, where psychohistorians would be talking amongst themselves in front of this mathematical structure projected on advanced visualizations, and their speech was so evolved that a normal human wouldn't even understand it at all. They would just subtly gesture or mumble, and there would be a very high bandwidth communication. Now, I will be happy to be one of the early adopters of Neuralink if it allows me to do something like that. But even without those kinds of enhancements, we will use AI tools to as a force multiplier of our persuasive abilities. Just for example, what I'm already doing today, writing and publishing more and maybe better prose, being able to articulate my thoughts faster and turn them into blog posts, illustrating them with images that supposedly the social media platforms are rewarding with a broader distribution because the image is there rather than being just text, and so on and so forth. Are the good guys going to win? In the past, it was so easy. Every battle was won by the good guys. Right? Yeah,
Eventually.
that is how we tell history.
Yeah. Right.
The bad guys lost and they were dead. They couldn't complain. So how are we going to make use of these tools in order to improve desirable and beneficial futures?
Well, one thing I think we need to be thinking more about is the application of electronic tools to citizen engagement and democratic accountability and new ways of decision making. Because the representative democratic form, many people are getting pretty tired of it and its failures and faults. The administrative state, as you've been talking about, is in need of serious reform. And artificial intelligence is one of the ways that that could happen. You know, just automating records is what, you know, the Veterans Administration takes, you know, like 2 years to get somebody inducted in the system because it's all paper records still. So I do think that we can make a lot of progress in these things, but I am very concerned about the questions of the strengthening of undemocratic forces and the strengthening of minor individuals and small groups with a variety of tools, bioweapons, for instance, and the threats that they pose. And I think part of the playoff that a lot of us are thinking about in this domain is, in order to control or mitigate these emerging risks of the new technologies, we may need a more and more invasive surveillance state. You know, George Church has argued that DNA printers should all come with a built-in system that tells you where they are, who's using it, and what they're printing, and that all that information should be sent to Brussels or someplace to make sure that no one's printing bioweapons. Now, of course, as soon as you propose that, it means that there's going to be a black market for broken machines that don't have that security in it. But I do think we need to be thinking very seriously about the surveillance risks. I mean, Ingmar Persson and Julian Savulescu gave an even more chimerical answer to these scenarios. They argued that we should do mandatory moral enhancement on everybody in order to prevent the emergence of psychopaths. And
isn't universal education a mandatory moral enhancement?
It is, and I think that this is one of the arguments. I mean, in the article that I wrote about automating the teaching profession, one of the things I take very seriously is that there is a moral and civic educational part of every educational system since the Chinese exam system was created 3,000 years ago. It's been a part of teaching people about what it means to be a citizen and a responsible person in your society. And I would want, and this is one of the risks of homeschooling, is that, you allow little Christian Taliban, madrasas to be set up all over the United States, and lo and behold, they storm the Capitol and try to establish a fascist dictatorship. And I would rather they have gone through public education and be told that the way to influence policy is by lobbying and voting. So I take that very seriously, that that there is an educational component. Now, your more general question is, how do we persuade people that the future could be a positive one and try to get them to go in the right direction? Is that where you're headed with that question?
I do think that the more people are active and proactive, and the more people believe that they can design their lives so that when they end up in the future, they will be in a place that they like to be, the better everyone will be off, rather than the opposite, where people are persuaded to be passive, to be angry, to be resigned, that they are disenfranchised and powerless, right? That it is absolutely not a symmetrical situation. The first is vastly outperforming the second in terms of reaction to a situation, and yeah.
Well, just one of the problems that we face, in my opinion, is that after World War II, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a collapse of utopian imagination. People's utopian imaginations are very limited these days. Fascism stepped into some of that gap. Modi, for 20 years, said everything will be better if we can make India a Hindu society, get rid of all these Muslims, and go back to Hindu values. They did 20 years of that, and now people are saying, wait a minute, we didn't get anything out of that. There are no benefits to that particular utopian vision. For me, the kinds of utopian visions that I think we need to motivate people, to get people moving in the same direction, are, for instance, a fully automated luxury society. I think that is a liberal, fully automated luxury society is a utopian society, as far as I'm concerned. It's a liberal utopia. I don't want everyone to be thinking the same thing, doing the same thing. That's been the problem, the bane of a lot of utopian projects. But I do think we could convince everybody that in this question of artificial intelligence and automation, that they could have a better future if we get to the other end with the right kind of policies. So, in terms of space exploration, for instance, this is basically performance art with some science added on at this point. I don't see space exploration. Space exploration has always been, for me, something that I want us to do, but it doesn't have a strong benefit. It doesn't redound to people's benefit. But one of its roles has always been, seeing Earth from space, and we're just on this one blue ball in the middle of emptiness. That perspective of the space program, which you mentioned earlier, that if we could expand into space and be a spacefaring civilization, I think that is the kind of utopian vision that I also share. Radical life extension, cyborg modification, control of our brains. I mean, I think all of these things could be parts of utopian visions to come of people who share our concern for both freedom and equality.
There are a lot of threads, and they are very interestingly intertwined. For example, we started talking about the American hegemony and the decline of the empire, and how America cannot afford anymore to be the police policing the world, or more benignly, to assure global trade of goods and services and oil through its military bases and control. It cannot afford it because of its ballooning deficit and public debt, and the potential expected outsized productivity increase due to AI and robots could actually make that deficit and debt bearable. Without it, couldn't have been, and isn't, but with it, it just could, if it arrives fast enough.
I think this is an open question about whether artificial intelligence will lead to the Dow, hitting 5 million or whatever it is. I think it's possible that we could have dramatic economic growth once. It's been hard to prove productivity advantages from automation over the years. I think there's a lot of changes in the way that we do work that have reduced the impacts of automation on productivity. I don't spend every minute of my day doing productive labor, right? And part of the things that are distracting people are the new things on the internet. But if there is dramatic economic growth, then the question is, does any of that money find its way into public coffers, and what do we do with it? We were talking earlier about taxing robots or automation. I'm not in favor of that necessarily, but the tremendous wealth inequality that has been created by this new technological economy needs more progressive taxation in order for some of that wealth to find its way back into public coffers. And then the question is, well, is spending on our global empire, defending the free trade with Taiwan, for instance, I think Taiwan's one of the hotspots. North Korea is a hotspot. If the United States gets embroiled in potentially nuclear confrontation with North Korea or China over Taiwan or North Korea, then we've got a whole new situation on our hands. And I don't want the U.S. just to withdraw from everywhere, right? I don't think that would be a good outcome either. I think there has to be a vision of what a post-U.S. military hegemony global regime looks like, something along the lines of a kind of NATO, an expanded NATO. Although the NATO is still pretty U.S. dominated, less democratic than I would like. But yes, I think you're right that theoretically, if the U.S. were a principal beneficiary of American firms that were taxable by the U.S. government, were the principal beneficiaries of a global economic boom. Sam Altman was trying to raise $7 trillion last year to create new AI chips and a whole new AI infrastructure. And presumably a lot of that would be based in the United States. As one of the examples of successful industrial policy is that Biden administration was able to get the infrastructure investments to be made in the United States, the changes in policy so that we aren't making them, 50 miles from the Chinese coast and instead making them in Texas.
With a dampener on the success of those policies, represented by the scarcity of skilled labor that is needed to build the chip fabs that are incentivized to be placed in the U.S. and TSMC already said, well, we'd love to, but we cannot find the people to build these things.
No. Which is
It is
another argument for the role of the state sector in innovation. Even if you think we need venture capital and free entrepreneurial activity in order to create new stuff, you also need educated workers. And the degree to which half of all
however,
college graduates in China are engineers, and it's
however,
only 5% in the States.
And too many lawyers, right? However, the longer demographic trend, contrary to what so many people, especially in the left, especially environmentalists, believe, is that of a demographic collapse. Japan, South Korea, Italy are leading in this grim trend.
Yeah.
But outside of Nigeria and some other African countries, basically the entire world is on track of not being able to sustain its population. And then it is not a question of educating the workers anymore. There's not going to be workers. So, do you think that ectogenesis could be an approach here that is going to be accelerated and then implemented? And for those who are following us who don't know the word, ectogenesis is the technology of artificial wombs, of the ability of bringing to term an animal or human life without the female of the species involved. So today, science fiction, just as advanced AI and humanoid robots, are still, for the next few days, science fiction. Is it going to play a role?
I don't want to be a conspiracy theorist, but last year, a minor Chinese government official talking in the Chinese press about their lack of success in convincing Chinese. I mean, the CCP ordered its party members to have 3 kids, and they're not even a 1 yet. So the party members just told it, screw it, not to mention the rest of the Chinese. So they were like, this guy was reflecting on the lack of success that they were having, and he said, we may have to industrialize the process. And I was just like, wait, what? Are we already there? Are we already a brave new world that we're going to start talking about babies in bottles because women don't want to have them anymore? But yes, I wrote about artificial womb. I've been writing about artificial wombs for 20 years, but I believe artificial wombs are inevitable. And I don't think that very many societies are prepared to wrap their mind around artificial wombs sponsored by the state. But for places like Denmark and other societies with fertility assistance, technology, access to fertility assistance, and in vitro fertilization, they have been offering fertility assistance to a wide category of women, women who are not married, lesbians, women up to the age of 50, et cetera, in order to try to encourage the birth rate. Egg freezing, which is beginning to pick up as well, is for many women caught in the, if I don't have kids by the time I'm 35, it's going to be really hard. Maybe I need to focus on my career until I'm 35 and then try later. So they turn to egg freezing. There are many things leading in the direction where artificial wombs would be yet another fertility assistance technology in this world of declining fertility. However, right now it still would require in vitro fertilization, which is uncertain and unpleasant and expensive in many places. So I don't know that artificial wombs are going to be, even if we crack the nut of a fully, knowing that we're going to safely produce a child from an artificial womb. The nut is partly cracked because we have neonatal intensive care from about 20 weeks on that does what it does, and then we can keep a fertilized embryo up to about 3 weeks at this point without major things going wrong, but we haven't fully connected the nuts there. When we do, I don't think very many people are going to pick it up. It's similar to the issue of cloning. I mean, not very many people actually want to be cloned or to clone, so I don't think it's going to have a major impact in our societies. But Yes, it is. You can imagine in a lifeboat kind of scenario, lifeboat meaning, you only have, like in Battlestar Galactica is a good example. They actually dealt with this in the first season. The robots attack, they kill everybody but 50,000 humans, I think it was. And then they have to decide what to do about abortion. Are women still in the Battlestar Galactica fleet still going to have reproductive freedom, or are they going to be required to have babies? And they fortunately made the decision there to not require women to have babies, which I think is the correct one. But you can see that if societies get really extreme, and especially in societies where women's rights are not taken for granted, like Afghanistan, that those kinds of options would be on the table.
There is an organization that we didn't mention, and I want your opinion on their ability to understand the situation unfolding that we analyze today, and their ability to play a role in the future, in the next handful of years. And these are the unions. In the past, they were crucial. Collective bargaining and representation and has been effective for defining and maintaining workers' rights. Uh, it doesn't seem to me that they realize what is going on, or what is going to happen, what is about to happen.
Well, my son is a labor organizer for nurses. My daughter is the head of her graduate student union, or one of the heads. And I'm a passionate supporter of the labor movement. The labor movement in the United States has gotten a huge boost over the last 5-6 years from young people waking up and realizing, hey, this is the right idea to have a labor union. Starbucks organizing, Amazon organizing, and so forth. At the same time, union membership in the United States continues to decline. Most of the, if you go back to classical Marxism, it's the innovation of putting a bunch of guys along one long assembly line that builds their sense of camaraderie and solidarity. And with the gigification of labor, it's harder and harder, the precarity, gigification, less commitment to firms over time, less commitment of firms to workers over time, a whole bunch of things, and the decline of big factories and the rise of white collar employment of various kinds. All of these have lent themselves to the labor union form not working very well as we go into the future. Only about 11% of American workers are in trade unions at this point. So getting anywhere close to Swedish 80% is going to be hard for most of the world. So one of the things I believe very firmly is that we need new forms of worker and citizen coordination and collective empowerment that will probably capitalize on the advantages of electronic communication more than traditional unions or political parties have. I think political parties are also on their way out. We've seen experiments in the political party side, we've seen experiments with liquid democracy, as it's sometimes called, in Europe. The Five-Star Movement in Italy, Podemos has had some liquid democracy innovations in Spain. So, and none of them have, the pirate parties have experimented things. None of them have really worked very well. I mean, Five Star in Italy came up with a completely incomprehensible populist mishmash of stuff. So I don't know that we've cracked the nut of electronic democracy or collective electronic empowerment yet. And certainly the flash mobs of the Arab Spring turned out to be chimerical as ways of changing society. But that has to be where it comes from, because we're, to being an active, engaged worker in a workplace with a union, or a citizen through a political party, takes a lot of work. And most people don't want to put in that work. And I understand that, I get it. And so we need to make it as easy as possible for people to collectively organize.
You mentioned Italy. The unions in Italy had a pretty big win. All the platforms, like the food delivery platforms and others that would classify their delivery people as contractors were forced to hire them instead. And in Italy, there is almost zero flexibility in the hours worked. So basically, these are now all full-time employees. Also, the unions of the taxi drivers were able to force Uber to have to go back to the garage and then only come to pick you up wherever you are without being able to cruise. But you have to wait half an hour for the Uber to get to you. And they charge you for the trip coming to you too. So basically, Uber doesn't exist anymore in Italy. And obviously, if you are one of those riders that these platforms actually hired, rather than those that they didn't, because it didn't make sense for them, or if you are a taxi driver, then you can look at these as victories, unless you look at the medium-term picture and you realize that both the riders and the taxi drivers are screwed because they are going to be automated away. And I use this as an example of the union fighting yesterday's battles, rather than even mapping out the contours of what the future is bringing.
Oh, I absolutely agree. We've had, of course, similar debates in the United States, and California has made moves in the direction of providing workers, gig workers, more traditional workers' rights. And I have mixed feelings about it. I think the general goal of social policy should be that people should be able to do gig work and still have health insurance and education and money to buy food. Um, the nature of gig work, I think, is a regulatory concern because, in general, the nature of all work is being intensified by artificial intelligence surveillance, and gig work is basically predicated on knowing where your workers are at every minute and what they're doing, and if they're not making money for you, then my first job was actually at McDonald's, and at McDonald's they would call in us young workers when they had a surge, right? So there you had no necessarily guaranteed hours. You had hours you were expected to be there, but so this is an old labor practice. But with artificial intelligence, it's counting your clicks on your laptop when you're working from home and things like that. So when you get to gig work, I do think that we need to regulate how workers are compensated within gig platforms. I'm very supportive of democratic gig work platform experiments where you could have more democratized ownership and decision making within an Uber or a Lyft or something like that. I am concerned, however, that allowing old legacy industries to regulate these new upstarts and competitors is not the right way to go. So I completely agree with your point about taxis and Uber having to go back to base or whatever. But yeah, and I think it's easy to imagine that a part of our path to technological unemployment will be the increasing gigification, just as we've already seen with the Amazon Turk and other ways that human labor has been gigified. I think that gigification is one of the things that we will see more of, and so we need to figure this out. I think it can be a very dispiriting and impoverishing kind of career without the right protections.
So at the beginning, I said that this was going to be unavoidably a conversation involving politics. Let's finish with politics as well. The US is an extremely resilient nation, swinging from one extreme to the next. And a lot of people forget that there have been in the 60s and 70s extremely tense moments where society appeared to be tearing itself apart, but then it didn't. Today, it looks like to a lot of people that whether Biden or Trump wins, there will be extreme reactions. If Biden wins, Trump supporters may not accept the result. If Trump wins, all kinds of extreme policies that he may put in place quite rapidly could exacerbate social tensions and rupture them in some kind of revolt. How do you see the situation in March 2025?
I've been reading a lot more fantasy literature because I just can't stand to think about it. But I'll tell you, politically, in college, I joined the what you would call social democratic organization here in the States, Democratic Socialists of America. They blew up in 2016 when Bernie Sanders ran for president. I'm a big Bernie supporter. And then I discovered that
Don't you feel guilty? Didn't Bernie elect Trump?
No, I don't think I don't think that that's a correct interpretation of it. I think Hillary elected Trump by being Hillary. But
to me, when she said that Trump voters are despicables, that is what elected Trump.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to get away from the role of evangelical Christianity, guns, the things that she was talking about in American politics. And I think, I'm on the same side as she is. But there are a lot of failures of Clintonite. And what we see that is the kind of necrotic remains of it with Biden. That whole kind of politics just doesn't turn people on. So anyway, I'm a big Bernie supporter, but it turns out that I don't have a lot in common with the millennial left and people under 30. So I'm a little bit politically homeless these days. I don't know exactly what to do personally about these things. I was a Connecticut party chair for the Democratic Socialists for a while, but in terms of this coming election, I think I still think Biden can squeak it out. One of the problems, and we were talking about this peripherally before, I think one of the problems is that when you get in these extreme situations, especially with charismatic leaders, people see the logic of extrajudicial action where, it becomes more salient for them. It's like, well, if elections aren't doing it, I have to start shooting people. I think we could see that in the United States. Unfortunately, the right in the United States outguns the left about 20-1. And so the left is never going to win, at the community level with guns. The best hope that we have is to hold on to the judicial, to the extent that we can. The Supreme Court's already more or less a lost cause, but hold on to the judiciary and then make sure that we can still get elected through legislatures and so forth. But trying to control Trump last time was hard enough. This time they're coming in with a vetted cadre of 50,000 federal appointees that they want to make, who all believe that the last election was stolen and that Trump should be dictator. And so I think if Trump's elected, my family, we're already in the process of looking into Italian citizenship. Of course, then you had to go elect a post-fascist government yourself, but at least Maloney's no Trump, so I may be your neighbor someday.
Okay. Interesting. With of course all kinds of trends around de-dollarization that could further precipitate.
Well, there's no evidence of de-dollarization yet. I mean, the BRICS concept turned out to be a chimera. I think this is. I do believe that cracking the resistance of Russia, North Korea, Iran, the Saudis to international law and the rules-based international order, as we would say, I think that is central to how we move forward. But I'm not so concerned that they're all on the same page. I don't think Russia has that much in common with China or India or Iran. I think they all have different agendas here. So
one of the things that I liked about the first Trump government is that he did not go to war with Iran. I actually expected it to happen. It
neither
did.
did Biden. Yes, both sides. Neither side of the United States wants to go to war with Iran. Iran would be a really hard war for the United States if we were actually involved with boots on the ground. We'd probably just bomb them to death.
So when you say the U.S. must crack it, what do you mean?
I mean that we need to clearly articulate what a reformed international rules-based order would look like in a way that is more than just window. And I think Israel, of course, has been a huge setback to this process. I think we were on the way after the West responded to the invasion of Ukraine to a coordinated Western advocacy for liberal democracy, war to defend the democratic order. And then Israel, or the October 6th events in Israel, too long to discuss, but it's made it very hard to make that case in the developing world. But we have to get back to making the case that stronger transnational institutions and everybody obeying by the same principles is the way forward. Now, for Iran and North Korea, that means bending to the international nuclear weapons non-proliferation agreements and potentially bioweapons and whatnot. I don't know what we do about Russia except get rid of Putin at some point. And I'm open to all suggestions. But China, I think that there could be rapid, discontinuous political change in China. No one saw the collapse of the Soviet Union coming, or very few. And I think the CCP could potentially change rapidly in the next decade or so. But on the other hand, if they try to invade Taiwan and there's a national war and they get bombed by the West, who knows what's going to happen. So, yeah, the world is a very uncertain place. Artificial intelligence, bioweapons, genetic engineering, all these things are just going to make it more uncertain. And I think that's the biggest lesson is that technology could be the unanticipatable change agent in the political dimensions of the future. And so, for instance, AI dominance could be one of those factors. It could be that the West, because we have a slight technological lead in artificial intelligence, that we will be able to dominate world affairs in ways that we can't currently imagine.
James, thank you very much. As we prepared for this conversation, you replied to me that all the topics I listed would require 6 hours of conversation, and certainly we could keep going, but at a couple of hours, I would say it was a good run for today.
I really appreciate it. Great questions.
And thank you. It was very good, and I know you are also writing a book. So when you get closer to having it ready, I will be happy to have you back.
I'll just say people have been asking for more than a decade for this book. The field of moral neuroscience, and we're starting a project right now, by the way, on brain-computer interfaces. You mentioned Neuralink earlier. We're going to be working for the next 2 years on white papers and a conference about brain-computer interfaces. Because if you go back to the original thinking about the singularity that Werner Vinge was doing, the alternative to being dominated by AI is for us to get smarter with this stuff and plug it into our brains. So I do have hopes about that. But I think the prospect of moral enhancement, that I was focusing more on genetics and drugs, is going to be increasingly about controlling our exocortex, our kind of computational systems that we use to control our own behavior. So that's the direction that's headed. The Cyborg Buddha project is going to be more weaving in more computational approaches to moral enhancement.
Well, fascinating, and looking forward to learn more, both through your publications, through your book, and then hopefully another conversation like this one in the future.
Good. Thanks, David.
Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for this episode of Searching for the Question Live. I am looking forward to keep exploring what are the implications of advanced technologies on the lives of individuals and in society overall. And we will keep doing it together with all of you.